The Vietnam War, a significant conflict of the 20th century, is rooted deeply in Vietnam's history of colonization and resistance. To fully understand the complexities of this war, it is essential to delve into the historical context that shaped it. This examination will cover the era of French colonization, the rise of nationalist movements, the impact of World War II, and the subsequent struggle for independence that led to the Vietnam War. Vietnam's struggle for independence began long before the Vietnam War, tracing back to the mid-19th century when it became part of French Indochina. French colonization brought profound changes to Vietnamese society, characterized by the exploitation of natural resources and the imposition of French culture. The French introduced a colonial economy that extracted rubber, rice, and other commodities, disrupting traditional agrarian life. Additionally, the French administration imposed Western education and Christianity, which altered the social fabric and created a class of educated Vietnamese who were increasingly discontent with colonial rule. French colonization. The resentment towards French exploitation and cultural imposition gave rise to Vietnamese nationalism. Educated elites, influenced by ideas of self-determination and liberty from Western political thought, began forming movements to resist colonial rule. Among these movements, the Indochinese Communist Party, founded by Ho Chi Minh in 1930, emerged as a pivotal force. Ho Chi Minh, educated abroad and well-versed in communist ideology, aimed to unite the Vietnamese people under the banner of independence and socialism. The early 20th century saw a proliferation of resistance movements, including both nationalist and communist factions, each contributing to the growing anti-colonial sentiment. Two resistance movements. The resistance against French rule became more organized and militant in the years leading up to World War II. The formation of the Viet Minh, a coalition of communist and nationalist groups, led by Ho Chi Minh, marked a significant step in this direction. The Viet Minh sought to rally the Vietnamese people around the cause of independence, using both political mobilization and guerrilla warfare. The presence of the Viet Minh in rural areas helped to establish a network of support among the peasantry, who were essential to the success of the movement. Post-World War II era. World War II brought dramatic changes to the region. During the war, Japan occupied Vietnam, effectively ending French control, albeit temporarily. The Japanese occupation disrupted the colonial administration and created a power vacuum that Vietnamese nationalists sought to exploit. The Viet Minh capitalized on this opportunity, receiving support from the Allies to resist Japanese forces, which bolstered their military capabilities and political influence. The end of Japanese occupation in 1945 left a void that the Viet Minh were quick to fill. Japanese occupation. With the defeat of Japan in 1945, Ho Chi Minh saw a historic opportunity to declare Vietnam's independence. On September 2, 1945, Ho Chi Minh announced the establishment of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam in a speech that drew heavily from the United States Declaration of Independence, emphasizing principles of liberty and equality. This declaration was a bold move aimed at securing international recognition and support. However, the major world powers, particularly France and the United States, were not ready to accept Vietnamese independence on these terms. France, determined to restore its colonial empire, sought to reassert control over Vietnam, setting the stage for further conflict. Declaration of Independence. The French attempts to reclaim their former colony led to the First Indochina War. Protracted conflict between the French colonial forces and the Viet Minh. This war, which lasted from 1946 to 1954, was marked by fierce battles and significant casualties on both sides. The Viet Minh, employing guerrilla tactics and leveraging popular support, gradually wore down the French forces. The war ended with the Geneva Accords of 1954, which temporarily divided Vietnam along the 17th parallel, with Ho Chi Minh's communist government in the north and a separate anti-communist regime in the south. This division was intended to be temporary, with nationwide elections planned for 1956 to reunify the country. 6. The First Indochina War and its aftermath. The Geneva Accords set the stage for a new phase of conflict. The temporary division of Vietnam highlighted the ideological struggle between communism and anti-communism, mirroring the broader Cold War tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. The United States, fearing the spread of communism in Southeast Asia, began to support the government of South Vietnam, led by Ngo Dinh Diem. This support included military aid and advisors, marking the beginning of a deeper American involvement that would escalate into the full-scale Vietnam War. By examining these historical developments, one gains a comprehensive understanding of the Vietnam War's origins. The war was not merely a local conflict, but a significant chapter in the global struggle between competing ideologies. Vietnam's long history of resistance against foreign domination, the impact of colonial exploitation, and the geopolitical shifts following World War II all contributed to the complexities of the Vietnam War. This context is crucial for understanding the motivations of the various actors involved and the profound impact the war had on Vietnam and the world. Chapter number 2. Early conflicts and division. The early stages of the Vietnam War were marked by intense conflicts and political maneuvering, laying the groundwork for the division of Vietnam that would define the conflict for years to come. The First Indochina War, fought between 1946 and 1954, set the stage for this turbulent period. The conflict emerged from the struggle between the Viet Minh, a nationalist and communist-led coalition, and the French colonial forces determined to reassert their control over Vietnam after World War II. First Indochina War, 1946 to 1954. The First Indochina War was characterized by a mix of guerrilla warfare and conventional military tactics. The Viet Minh, under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh, employed guerrilla tactics effectively against the French. Their strategy involved hit-and-run attacks, ambushes, and utilizing their knowledge of the local terrain to undermine the French forces. On the other hand, the French relied on their conventional military superiority, including superior firepower and resources. Key battles during this period were instrumental in shaping the course of the war. The Battle of Hanoi in 1946 was one of the early engagements, where the Viet Minh demonstrated their determination and ability to challenge French authority. The Battle of Route Colonial 4 in 1950 was another significant confrontation, illustrating the ongoing struggle between the French and Viet Minh forces as they fought over control of strategic supply routes. However, the most pivotal and decisive battle of the war was the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954. The Viet Minh's successful siege of the French garrison at Dien Bien Phu marked a turning point in the conflict. The French forces, trapped and outnumbered, faced a devastating defeat. This loss was critical as it forced the French government to reconsider their position in Vietnam. Dien Bien Phu and French surrender. The outcome of the Battle of Dien Bien Phu had profound implications for the future of Vietnam. The Viet Minh's victory in this protracted siege was a major blow to French military and political prestige. Faced with mounting pressure and the realization that they could not sustain the war effort, the French government sought a negotiated settlement. The French surrender at Dien Bien Phu led to the Geneva Conference, where an agreement was reached to end hostilities and establish a framework for the future of Vietnam. Geneva Accords, 1954. The Geneva Accords, signed in July 1954, brought a temporary resolution to the First Indochina War. The accords stipulated that Vietnam would be divided at the 17th parallel, creating a temporary separation between North and South Vietnam. The North was to be governed by Ho Chi Minh and the communist-led Democratic Republic of Vietnam, while the South was led by Emperor Bao Day under the State of Vietnam. The accords also called for nationwide elections to be held in 1956 to reunify the country under a single government. However, these elections were never held, and the division of Vietnam became more entrenched. The political atmosphere following the Geneva Accords saw the establishment of two opposing regimes: North Vietnam, which pursued a communist agenda, and South Vietnam, which, with significant support from the United States, sought to establish a non-communist state. This division not only set the stage for further internal conflict, but also entangled Vietnam in the broader Cold War struggle between communism and anti-communism. The early conflicts and subsequent division of Vietnam were thus marked by a complex interplay of military engagements, diplomatic negotiations, and ideological battles. The outcomes of these events laid the foundation for the protracted and devastating conflict that would follow, shaping the trajectory of Vietnam's history and its role in global geopolitics. Chapter number 3: Rising Tensions and U.S. Involvement. The period from 1950 to 1963 was marked by escalating tensions and increasing American involvement in Vietnam, driven largely by Cold War anxieties and the strategic imperatives of containing communism. This era laid the foundation for the later, more extensive U.S. military engagement in the region, reflecting a broader geopolitical struggle between the Western powers and communist forces. One early U.S. involvement, 1950 to 1963. In the early 1950s, the United States' involvement in Vietnam began as part of a larger effort to counter the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. Following World War II and the emergence of the Cold War, the U.S. government, guided by the doctrine of containment, sought to prevent the expansion of communist influence. This commitment led to substantial American financial and military support for France, which was struggling to maintain its colonial presence in Vietnam against the Vietnamese nationalist and communist insurgency. By 1954, as the conflict intensified and the French faced mounting challenges, the U.S. was covering around 80% of the French war costs in Vietnam. This significant financial contribution underscored America's determination to support its allies and curb the spread of communism, reflecting the high stakes perceived by U.S. policymakers. As the French withdrew from Vietnam, following their defeat at Dien Bien Phu and the Geneva Accords, which led to the temporary division of Vietnam at the 17th parallel, the United States stepped in to fill the void. The U.S. played a pivotal role in shaping the political landscape of South Vietnam, backing Ngo Dinh Diem as the leader of the newly established Republic of Vietnam. Diem, a staunch anti-communist, was seen by the U.S. as a crucial ally in the struggle against communist forces. The American support was aimed at establishing a stable, non-communist government in South Vietnam that could effectively counter the influence of North Vietnam and the Viet Cong. However, Diem's rule quickly became contentious. His government was characterized by widespread corruption and repressive policies, which alienated significant segments of the Vietnamese population. Diem's refusal to hold the nationwide elections promised in the Geneva Accords further exacerbated tensions. His oppressive measures against political opponents, particularly Buddhists, led to widespread discontent and insurgency. The growing resistance in the South reflected the increasing instability and dissatisfaction with Diem's regime, challenging the very stability that U.S. support was intended to foster. The period of early U.S. involvement was thus a time of rising tensions and complex political dynamics. The American strategy of supporting French efforts and later backing Diem's government was driven by a desire to contain communism, but was complicated by the internal issues and growing resistance within South Vietnam. This backdrop of political instability and conflict set the stage for the deeper U.S. involvement that would escalate into a full-scale military engagement in the years to come. The interplay of Cold War geopolitics and local resistance dynamics during this period played a crucial role in shaping the trajectory of the Vietnam War. Chapter number 4: Full-scale U.S. engagement. The full-scale U.S. engagement in the Vietnam War, which began in earnest in 1964, marked a significant escalation in American military and political involvement. This period was defined by a series of crucial events and decisions that would profoundly impact the course of the conflict and shape the broader geopolitical landscape. 1. Gulf of Tonkin Incident, 1964. The Gulf of Tonkin Incident, occurring in August 1964, was a defining moment in U.S. involvement in Vietnam. On August 2, 1964, the USS Maddox, an American destroyer on a routine intelligence-gathering mission in the Gulf of Tonkin, was allegedly attacked by 3 North Vietnamese torpedo boats. The following day, on August 4, reports suggested a second attack on the USS Maddox and the USS Turner Joy, another destroyer that had joined the Maddox. These reports, however, were later questioned, with evidence suggesting that the second attack might not have occurred as initially claimed. The initial reports were based on intercepted communications and radar sightings, which were later found to be ambiguous and potentially misinterpreted. The incident was instrumental in shaping U.S. policy. On August 7, 1964, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution in response to the alleged attacks. This resolution granted President Lyndon B. Johnson the authority to use military force in Vietnam without a formal declaration of war. The resolution passed with overwhelming bipartisan support, reflecting the widespread Cold War consensus on the need to combat communist expansion. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution effectively provided the legal and political basis for the escalation of U.S. military involvement in Vietnam. It led to a rapid increase in troop deployments and military operations, significantly altering the scale and nature of American engagement in the conflict. 2. Escalation of U.S. military presence. Following the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, the U.S. dramatically expanded its military presence in Vietnam. The initial deployment of combat troops began in March 1965, with the arrival of the 9th Marine Expeditionary Brigade. By the end of 1965, the U.S. had committed over 180,000 troops to Vietnam, a number that would swell to over 500,000 by 1968. This escalation was driven by the belief that a robust military presence was necessary to stabilize South Vietnam and counter the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces. The buildup included not only ground troops but also extensive air and naval assets. The U.S. military constructed numerous bases and airfields, conducted large-scale operations, and provided extensive logistical and intelligence support. This massive influx of resources aimed to achieve several strategic objectives: to bolster the South Vietnamese government, to disrupt the North Vietnamese supply lines, and to weaken the Viet Cong's insurgency. The escalation also involved increased strategic bombing campaigns and large-scale ground operations, reflecting the growing American commitment to the conflict. 3. Operation Rolling Thunder, 1965 to 1968. Operation Rolling Thunder was a major component of the U.S. strategy during this period. Launched in March 1965, it was a sustained bombing campaign designed to cripple North Vietnam's ability to support the Viet Cong insurgency in the south. The campaign targeted key infrastructure, including supply routes, industrial facilities, and transportation networks. The bombing also aimed to disrupt North Vietnamese logistical support and weaken their resolve. Operation Rolling Thunder saw the deployment of massive air power, with B-52 bombers and other aircraft dropping millions of tons of bombs over North Vietnam. The campaign was marked by its intensity and scale, making it one of the most extensive aerial bombardment campaigns of the Vietnam War. Despite the heavy bombardment, Operation Rolling Thunder failed to achieve its primary objectives. The North Vietnamese demonstrated remarkable resilience, and the campaign did not significantly diminish their capacity to support the Viet Cong. Instead, it contributed to the growing anti-war sentiment in the U.S. and internationally, due to the extensive civilian casualties and destruction it caused. The bombing campaign also had severe humanitarian impacts. It led to significant loss of life among Vietnamese civilians and caused widespread damage to infrastructure. The use of cluster bombs and chemical agents, such as Agent Orange, had long-lasting environmental and health consequences, further complicating the conflict's impact. The failure of Operation Rolling Thunder highlighted the limitations of air power in achieving strategic objectives and underscored the challenges faced by U.S. military planners in a conflict characterized by guerrilla warfare and political complexity. The period of full-scale U.S. engagement in Vietnam, from the Gulf of Tonkin incident through Operation Rolling Thunder, was marked by a dramatic escalation in military and political commitment. The Gulf of Tonkin incident provided the legislative foundation for increased American involvement, while the subsequent military buildup and Operation Rolling Thunder reflected the growing intensity of the conflict. Despite these efforts, the limitations of U.S. strategies and the complexities of the Vietnam War became increasingly apparent, setting the stage for continued escalation and deepening involvement in the years that followed. Chapter number 5. Ground Warfare and Major Battles. The Vietnam War's ground warfare phase was marked by significant battles that highlighted the evolving nature of combat and the profound impact of both tactical decisions and public perception on the course of the conflict. The major battles of this period not only showcased innovative military strategies, but also underscored the complexities and challenges faced by U.S. forces in Vietnam. 1. Ia Drang Valley, 1965. The Battle of Ia Drang Valley, fought from November 14 to November 18, 1965, was one of the first major engagements involving U.S. ground troops and was pivotal in demonstrating the effectiveness of air mobility and helicopter warfare. This battle, which took place in the central highlands of Vietnam, was significant for several reasons. The U.S. forces, primarily composed of the 1st Cavalry Division, Air Mobile, utilized helicopters to rapidly deploy troops into and out of the battlefield, tactic that would become a hallmark of American operations in Vietnam. This innovative use of air mobility allowed U.S. forces to engage the enemy quickly and with flexibility, contrasting sharply with the traditional ground-based warfare of previous conflicts. The battle at Landing Zone, LZ, X-ray, exemplified the effectiveness of air and artillery support in U.S. operations. Despite being initially outnumbered by the North Vietnamese troops, the U.S. forces managed to secure a tactical victory through the use of concentrated firepower and well-coordinated air support. The successful repulsion of North Vietnamese attacks at LZ X-ray highlighted the advantages of modern military technology and tactics. However, the subsequent battle at LZ Albany revealed the vulnerabilities and challenges of the air mobile approach. U.S. forces, while initially achieving success, were ambushed by a large North Vietnamese force during their withdrawal from LZ X-ray. This encounter led to significant casualties for the U.S. troops, underscoring the dangers of operating in a complex and hostile environment where the enemy could exploit opportunities for close-quarters combat. The contrasting outcomes of LZ X-ray and LZ Albany illustrated the unpredictable nature of ground warfare in Vietnam and the high stakes involved in each engagement. 2. Tet Offensive, 1968. The Tet Offensive, launched by the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong on January 30, 1968, was a major turning point in the Vietnam War. Coordinated attacks were executed across South Vietnam, targeting key cities and military installations, including Saigon and Hue, during the Tet Lunar New Year holiday. The offensive aimed to spark a general uprising among the South Vietnamese population and significantly weaken U.S. resolve by demonstrating that the North Vietnamese forces could strike at the heart of South Vietnam's security. Despite the initial successes of the offensive, including the surprise attacks on well-defended urban areas, it ultimately proved to be a military failure for the North Vietnamese. The U.S. and South Vietnamese forces, though caught off guard, managed to repel the attacks and regain control of the contested areas. The North Vietnamese forces suffered heavy casualties and failed to achieve their strategic objectives of inciting widespread rebellion. However, the Tet Offensive was a psychological victory for the North Vietnamese. The intense and graphic media coverage of the offensive, including the brutal images of attacks and the destruction in major cities, had a profound impact on U.S. public opinion. The contrast between the optimistic assessments of progress reported by the U.S. government and the reality depicted in the media contributed to growing anti-war sentiment among the American public. This shift in public opinion intensified calls for de-escalation and influenced the political discourse surrounding the war. The media coverage of the Tet Offensive played a crucial role in altering public perception. Graphic images and reports of the offensive's devastation exposed the harsh realities of the conflict, leading to increased skepticism about the U.S. government's handling of the war and prompting a re-evaluation of America's involvement in Vietnam. This change in public sentiment marked a significant development in the war's trajectory and had lasting effects on U.S. foreign policy and military strategy. The major battles of Ia Drang Valley and the Tet Offensive exemplify the complex nature of ground warfare in the Vietnam War. The Ia Drang Valley highlighted the innovations and challenges of air mobility and close-quarters combat, while the Tet Offensive demonstrated the interplay between military strategy and public perception. The outcomes of these battles not only influenced the tactical approach of U.S. forces, but also had significant implications for American public opinion and policy decisions, reflecting the multifaceted nature of the Vietnam War and its impact on both the battlefield and the home front. Chapter number 6. Political and social impact in the U.S. The Vietnam War profoundly influenced American society and politics, sparking a range of social movements and shifting public opinion in significant ways. This impact was felt across various spheres, from conscription and protests to media coverage and cultural expressions. One, draft and anti-war movement. The Vietnam War's draft system had notable social implications, particularly for lower-income and minority communities. The selective service system, which was responsible for conscription, often disproportionately affected these groups, exacerbating existing inequalities. Young men from poorer backgrounds and racial minorities were more likely to be drafted, leading to a sense of injustice and fueling widespread protests against the war. The draft not only intensified the anti-war sentiment, but also highlighted broader issues of social and economic disparity within American society. Key protests and demonstrations became central to the anti-war movement, which grew increasingly vocal and organized over time. One of the major events was the March on the Pentagon in 1967, where thousands of demonstrators gathered to oppose the war and challenge the government's policies. This demonstration was symbolic of the growing discontent and the public's desire to end the conflict. Another significant event was the moratorium to end the war in Vietnam in 1969, which saw millions of Americans participating in rallies and demonstrations nationwide, reflecting a broad-based opposition to the war. The Kent State shootings in May 1970 marked a tragic and pivotal moment in the anti-war movement. During a protest at Kent State University, Ohio National Guardsmen fired into a crowd of students, killing 4 and wounding 9. This incident galvanized anti-war sentiment and heightened the visibility of the anti-war movement, as it underscored the often violent confrontations between protesters and authorities. The anti-war movement also had a substantial cultural impact, with music, literature, and films playing a crucial role in shaping public opinion. Songs like Bob Dylan's "Blowin' in the Wind" and anti-war protest music by bands such as Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young became anthems for the movement, reflecting and amplifying the public's growing disillusionment with the war. Literature and films, such as The Pentagon Papers and Apocalypse Now, further contributed to the cultural critique of the war, highlighting its impact on American society and influencing public discourse. 2. Media influence. The role of media in shaping public perception of the Vietnam War was unprecedented, as it brought the realities of combat into American living rooms like never before. Television became a crucial medium for war coverage, with reporters and journalists providing on-the-ground reports that had a significant impact on public opinion. Journalists like Walter Cronkite, often referred to as the most trusted man in America, play a pivotal role in shaping the narrative of the war through their reporting. His commentary on the Tet Offensive, for example, contributed to the growing skepticism about the government's optimistic claims regarding the progress of the war. The Tet Offensive of 1968 was a watershed moment in media coverage, as the extensive and graphic reporting on the attacks revealed the gap between official statements and the realities of the conflict. The shocking images and reports of the offensive exposed the brutal nature of the war and contributed to increasing public disillusionment. The My Lai massacre, which came to light in 1969, further intensified the scrutiny of U.S. military operations. The massacre, in which American soldiers killed hundreds of unarmed Vietnamese civilians, was extensively covered by the media and became a symbol of the moral and ethical issues associated with the war. The extensive media coverage of such events played a critical role in influencing public perception, prompting calls for accountability and reform. In summary, the Vietnam War had a profound political and social impact on the United States, driven by conscription issues, powerful anti-war protests, and transformative media coverage. The draft's social implications, combined with high-profile protests and a growing cultural critique, contributed to a shifting public opinion that questioned the war's legitimacy and the government's conduct. Media coverage, with its graphic and immediate portrayal of the war's realities, played a crucial role in shaping this evolving perspective and influencing the course of American policy and society. Chapter number 7: Challenges and Tactics. The Vietnam War was characterized by a complex and challenging environment where both sides employed innovative and unconventional tactics that profoundly impacted the course of the conflict. The Viet Cong's guerrilla warfare strategies, coupled with U.S. military approaches, shaped the nature of the war and its outcomes. 1. Viet Cong and guerrilla warfare. The Viet Cong, the communist forces fighting in South Vietnam, utilized a highly effective system of guerrilla warfare that capitalized on their deep understanding of the terrain and their ability to blend into the civilian population. One of their most notable tactics was the extensive use of tunnel systems. These networks of tunnels, stretching across vast areas, served multiple purposes. They provided hiding places, storage for supplies and weapons, and bases for launching surprise attacks against U.S. and South Vietnamese forces. The tunnels were often complex, with multiple levels, air vents, and connecting passages. The Viet Cong also used these tunnels for living quarters and medical facilities, making them a critical part of their operational strategy. To combat the threat posed by these tunnels, the U.S. military deployed specialized units known as tunnel rats. These soldiers were tasked with entering and clearing the tunnel networks. The work was exceptionally dangerous and challenging due to the cramped, dark, and often booby-trapped conditions inside the tunnels. Tunnel rats faced the constant threat of booby traps and hostile combatants in a confined and claustrophobic environment. Their missions required extraordinary bravery and skill, as they navigated through narrow passages while trying to neutralize the enemy's advantage. The Viet Cong's ambushes and unconventional tactics further compounded the difficulties faced by U.S. forces. The Viet Cong employed hit-and-run strategies, laying booby traps and staging ambushes to inflict casualties and disrupt American operations. These tactics were designed to counter the superior firepower and technological advantages of the U.S. military. By avoiding direct confrontations and instead relying on surprise and deception, the Viet Cong managed to inflict significant damage while minimizing their own losses. The dense jungles, mountainous terrain, and rural landscapes of Vietnam provided ideal conditions for such guerrilla tactics, making it difficult for conventional forces to effectively engage the enemy. 2. U.S. military strategies. In response to the Viet Cong's guerrilla tactics, the U.S. military adopted several strategies aimed at locating and eliminating enemy forces, though these strategies often had unintended consequences. One of the primary strategies was the search and destroy mission. The goal of these operations was to locate Viet Cong strongholds and infrastructure, engage in direct combat, and eliminate the enemy. However, These missions frequently led to high civilian casualties and widespread destruction. The search and destroy strategy often involved sweeping through villages and rural areas, which in many cases resulted in the displacement of civilians and the destruction of homes and farmland. This approach not only failed to effectively address the guerrilla threat, but also fueled anti-American sentiment and provided propaganda opportunities for the Viet Cong. Another controversial tactic employed by the U.S. military was the use of chemical defoliants, most notably Agent Orange. The primary objective of using Agent Orange was to strip the dense jungle canopy of its foliage, thereby denying the Viet Cong cover and reducing their ability to hide and maneuver. However, the use of these chemical agents had severe and long-lasting consequences. Agent Orange and other defoliants caused widespread environmental damage, destroying vast swaths of forest and farmland. The chemical exposure also had significant health impacts on both Vietnamese civilians and U.S. military personnel. Many individuals who came into contact with Agent Orange suffered from serious health issues, including cancer and other chronic conditions. The environmental degradation and health problems resulting from the use of chemical defoliants contributed to the broader controversy and criticism surrounding U.S. military tactics in Vietnam. The Vietnam War's complex nature was marked by the clash between Viet Cong guerrilla tactics and U.S. military strategies. The Viet Cong's use of tunnel systems, ambushes, and unconventional warfare presented significant challenges to U.S. forces, forcing them to adapt their strategies in an attempt to counter these methods. The U.S. military's response, including search and destroy missions and the use of chemical defoliants, had profound implications, not only impacting the course of the war, but also shaping the broader context of the conflict's legacy. The interplay between these tactics and strategies highlighted the difficulties of fighting a war in such a challenging and unfamiliar environment, with lasting consequences for both the conflict and its participants. Chapter number 8: International Dynamics. The Vietnam War was not merely a localized conflict, but a battleground of broader international interests, with significant involvement from major global players like the Soviet Union and China, as well as contributions from various allied forces. The war's dynamics were deeply intertwined with Cold War geopolitics, as both sides sought to assert their influence and ideologies on the global stage. 1. Soviet and Chinese support. The Soviet Union and China played crucial roles in supporting North Vietnam during the war. Their assistance was a key element of their broader Cold War strategies, aimed at countering U.S. influence and promoting communist ideology. Both nations provided substantial military aid, which included a range of weapons, training, and logistical support essential for North Vietnam's war effort. Soviet aid consisted of advanced weaponry such as surface-to-air missiles, anti-aircraft guns, and tanks, which were critical in countering U.S. air superiority and armored operations. The Soviet Union also facilitated the training of North Vietnamese troops, enhancing their combat capabilities. China's support was similarly significant, offering both military and logistical assistance. The Chinese government provided weapons, including rifles and artillery, and also played a crucial role in training North Vietnamese forces. Additionally, China supported North Vietnam with infrastructure development, such as constructing roads and bridges necessary for the movement of troops and supplies. This support was not without its complications, however. As the war progressed, the relationship between China and North Vietnam became strained over issues such as the level of control exerted by China and the strategic direction of the war. Political motivations behind this support were deeply rooted in the Cold War context. For the Soviet Union, aiding North Vietnam was a way to challenge U.S. dominance in Southeast Asia and advance the global spread of communism. China, under Mao Zedong, viewed the conflict through a similar lens, seeing the support of North Vietnam as part of its broader effort to combat Western influence and promote socialist revolutions across Asia. Both nations sought to extend their influence and counter U.S. hegemony, making Vietnam a proxy battleground in the global struggle between communism and capitalism. Two Allied forces. In addition to the superpowers, several Allied nations contributed troops and resources to support the U.S. and South Vietnam. Countries such as South Korea, Australia, and Thailand sent military personnel to aid in the war effort. South Korea, for example, deployed a substantial number of troops to Vietnam, making it one of the largest contributors of foreign forces after the United States. Australian and Thai forces also participated, providing crucial support in various capacities, including combat operations and logistical assistance. These contributions, while valuable, varied in impact and effectiveness. The Allied forces, though generally supportive, faced their own challenges and limitations. Differences in military strategies and objectives often led to coordination difficulties among the Allied forces. Each country had its own political and strategic interests, which sometimes led to conflicting priorities and approaches. For instance, South Korean troops were primarily focused on securing specific areas and protecting their own interests, which did not always align seamlessly with U.S. operational goals. The varying levels of commitment and operational strategies among the Allied nations sometimes complicated joint efforts and hindered overall effectiveness. In summary, the Vietnam War was deeply influenced by international dynamics, with significant contributions from both the Soviet Union and China, each driven by Cold War strategies and ideological goals. The involvement of Allied forces added another layer of complexity to the conflict, as their contributions were shaped by their own national interests and strategies. The interplay between these international factors not only affected the conduct of the war, but also underscored the broader geopolitical stakes involved in the Vietnam conflict. Chapter number 9: Decline and Withdrawal. The Vietnam War, marked by its protracted conflict and complex international involvement, entered a phase of decline and withdrawal as U.S. strategy shifted, and the conflict neared its conclusion. This period was characterized by strategic adjustments, diplomatic negotiations, and the eventual fall of Saigon, which signaled the end of the war and the reunification of Vietnam under communist rule. 1. Vietnamization policy. The Vietnamization policy, introduced by President Richard Nixon, was a key element of the U.S. strategy during the late stages of the war. Nixon's approach was designed to gradually reduce American military involvement while increasing the capability of South Vietnamese forces to handle combat operations. The central idea behind Vietnamization was to shift the burden of the conflict onto South Vietnamese troops, thereby allowing for a phased withdrawal of U.S. forces. This strategy aimed to ensure that South Vietnam could sustain itself against North Vietnamese aggression once American troops were withdrawn. The policy involved significant efforts to train and equip South Vietnamese soldiers, thereby enhancing their ability to defend their country independently. The implementation of Vietnamization was accompanied by significant political and military challenges. While it allowed for a reduction in U.S. troop levels, it did not immediately translate into a sustainable peace in South Vietnam. The strategy faced criticism for its mixed results. Although it succeeded in reducing American casualties, it did not fully address the underlying issues of the conflict or significantly alter the trajectory of the war. 2. Paris Peace Accords, 1973. The Paris Peace Accords, signed in January 1973, marked a formal agreement to end U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. The accords were negotiated between the United States, North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and the Viet Cong, with the primary objectives being a ceasefire and the establishment of terms for U.S. withdrawal. According to the agreement, U.S. troops were to be withdrawn, and both sides were to work towards a political solution to the conflict. The accords also included provisions for the return of American prisoners of war and an arrangement for the peaceful resolution of the conflict. Despite the agreements reached in Paris, the fighting between North and South Vietnam continued. The peace accords failed to bring about a lasting resolution to the conflict, as hostilities resumed almost immediately after the U.S. withdrawal began. The agreement left many issues unresolved, particularly regarding the political future of South Vietnam, which contributed to ongoing instability and conflict. 3. Fall of Saigon, 1975. The final phase of the Vietnam War culminated in the fall of Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, in April 1975. The events leading to this collapse were marked by a series of North Vietnamese offensives and a significant decline in South Vietnamese morale and military capability. North Vietnam, having strengthened its position through continued military campaigns and international support, launched a decisive offensive that overwhelmed South Vietnamese forces. The fall of Saigon was a dramatic and chaotic event, characterized by the hurried evacuation of U.S. personnel and South Vietnamese allies. In the final days of the war, thousands of people scrambled to escape the advancing North Vietnamese troops. The United States orchestrated a large-scale airlift to evacuate personnel and at-risk South Vietnamese, but many were left behind as the city fell. The collapse of Saigon led to the reunification of Vietnam under communist rule. North Vietnamese troops entered the city, and the establishment of the Socialist Republic of Vietnam marked the end of the conflict. The reunification was followed by a period of significant political and economic transformation as the country adjusted to the new political reality. In summary, the decline and withdrawal phase of the Vietnam War was characterized by Nixon's Vietnamization policy, aimed at reducing U.S. involvement while strengthening South Vietnamese forces. This period also saw the signing of the Paris Peace Accords, which, while ending American combat operations, did not halt the conflict between North and South Vietnam. The eventual fall of Saigon in 1975 marked the dramatic conclusion of the war, leading to the reunification of Vietnam and the end of the protracted and divisive conflict. Chapter number 10. Reasons for U.S. loss. The Vietnam War's conclusion and the eventual U.S. withdrawal were shaped by a complex interplay of military, strategic, political, and social factors that contributed to the loss. Understanding these reasons requires an exploration of the failures in military strategy, the political and social dynamics within the U.S., and the remarkable resilience in tactics employed by North Vietnam. 1. Military and strategic failures. One of the primary reasons for the U.S. loss in Vietnam was a series of critical misjudgments and miscalculations. U.S. military and political leaders consistently underestimated the resolve and capabilities of the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces. The American strategy largely relied on conventional warfare methods, including large-scale troop deployments and firepower, which were ineffective against the guerrilla tactics employed by their opponents. This misalignment of strategy with the realities of asymmetric warfare hindered U.S. effectiveness on the ground. Furthermore, technological and tactical disadvantages played a significant role in the U.S. defeat. The dense jungles and challenging terrain of Vietnam presented formidable obstacles to American forces, who were equipped and trained for more traditional combat scenarios. The Viet Cong's use of intricate tunnel systems and their ability to blend in with the civilian population made it exceedingly difficult for U.S. troops to engage effectively in secure areas, contributing to the overall strategic struggle. 2. Political and social factors. On the political front, the lack of clear and achievable objectives further undermined U.S. efforts in Vietnam. The shifting goals and evolving strategies created confusion and eroded the coherence of the American war effort. This ambiguity prevented a unified approach and hindered the ability to measure progress effectively, which was crucial in a protracted conflict. Domestically, growing anti-war sentiment and political opposition became increasingly influential. Public protests, media criticism, and vocal dissent created significant pressure on the U.S. government, limiting its ability to sustain the war effort. This internal dissent affected political will and contributed to policy shifts that ultimately led to a reduction in American involvement. 3. North Vietnamese resilience. In contrast, North Vietnam exhibited extraordinary resilience and strategic acumen. The North Vietnamese leadership demonstrated an unwavering determination to achieve their goals, despite facing substantial losses. Their ability to endure and continue fighting was supported by effective use of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a crucial supply line that facilitated the movement of troops and resources from North to South Vietnam. The North Vietnamese also adeptly utilized their resources and the terrain to their advantage. The dense jungle and extensive tunnel networks not only provided strategic cover, but also allowed them to maintain the initiative and evade direct confrontations with superior U.S. firepower. This effective utilization of the environment and tactical ingenuity played a significant role in their sustained resistance and eventual victory. In summary, the U.S. loss in Vietnam was a result of a combination of military and strategic failures, political and social challenges, and the formidable resilience of North Vietnamese forces. Misjudgments in military strategy, technological and tactical disadvantages, unclear objectives, and growing domestic opposition all contributed to the difficulties faced by the U.S. The North Vietnamese, through their determination and strategic use of resources, managed to counter these challenges and ultimately achieve their objectives. Chapter number 11. Why the Vietnam War was dangerous. The Vietnam War presented an array of unique and severe dangers, making it one of the most challenging and controversial conflicts of the 20th century. The nature of the warfare, the human cost, and the use of chemical agents all contributed to the war's profound and enduring impact on both the soldiers involved and the civilian population. Nature of warfare. One of the most defining aspects of the Vietnam War was the guerrilla tactics employed by the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces. Their unconventional strategies included ambushes, booby traps, and hit-and-run attacks, which were designed to exploit the terrain and civilian population to their advantage. The Viet Cong's ability to blend seamlessly with the local population made it extremely difficult for U.S. and Allied forces to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. This unpredictability not only complicated military operations, but also led to significant challenges in maintaining security and control. The harsh environmental conditions in Vietnam further exacerbated the difficulties faced by soldiers. The dense jungles, characterized by thick foliage and rugged terrain, provided ample cover for Viet Cong fighters and made conventional military operations exceedingly difficult. Additionally, the climate, marked by intense heat, high humidity, and frequent monsoon rains, posed severe physical challenges, contributing to heat exhaustion, disease, and general fatigue among troops. The combination of these factors created a uniquely grueling combat environment that tested the limits of the soldiers' endurance and adaptability. Human cost. The human cost of the Vietnam War was staggering. Casualties among both military personnel and civilians were alarmingly high, reflecting the intense and widespread nature of the conflict. U.S. and Allied forces suffered significant losses, with thousands of soldiers killed or wounded. The civilian toll was equally tragic, with extensive casualties among Vietnamese men, women, and children. Beyond the immediate physical injuries and deaths, the psychological impact of the war was profound. Many veterans returned home with severe psychological trauma, including post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, which had lasting effects on their mental health and overall well-being. The brutal nature of the conflict, exemplified by incidents such as the My Lai massacre, where U.S. soldiers killed hundreds of unarmed Vietnamese civilians, further contributed to the psychological strain on both soldiers and the general public. Such events not only caused deep moral and ethical concerns, but also had a profound impact on the American public's perception of the war, fueling anti-war sentiment and contributing to a growing sense of disillusionment. Chemical warfare. The Vietnam War also saw the widespread use of chemical agents, most notably Agent Orange, a herbicide used to defoliate the dense jungles and eliminate cover for Viet Cong forces. The extensive spraying of Agent Orange had severe and long-lasting health effects on both Vietnamese civilians and U.S. veterans. Exposure to the chemical caused a range of serious health issues, including cancers, birth defects, and other chronic conditions. The impact on Vietnamese populations was particularly devastating, with entire communities suffering from the long-term effects of contamination. The ethical and environmental concerns surrounding the use of chemical warfare were significant. The indiscriminate nature of the herbicides led to extensive ecological damage, destroying forests and disrupting local ecosystems. This environmental degradation had a lasting impact on agriculture, wildlife, and the overall health of the land. The use of chemical agents raised profound ethical questions about the methods of warfare and the responsibility of nations to minimize harm to both people and the environment. In conclusion, the Vietnam War was dangerous due to its unconventional tactics, harsh environmental conditions, high human cost, and the controversial use of chemical warfare. These factors combined to create a conflict that was not only physically and psychologically challenging for those involved, but also had far-reaching consequences for both the environment and the ethical standards of warfare. The legacy of the Vietnam War continues to resonate, underscoring the complex and often devastating nature of modern conflicts. Chapter number 12. Legacy of the Vietnam War. The legacy of the Vietnam War is profound, affecting both Vietnam and the United States in multifaceted ways. The aftermath of the conflict led to significant transformations in Vietnam, while also precipitating substantial changes in U.S. military policy and cultural reflection. The war's enduring impact on both nations continues to shape their historical narratives and public consciousness. One impact on Vietnam. Following the end of the Vietnam War in 1975, the country faced the daunting task of reunification and reconstruction under communist rule. The fall of Saigon and the subsequent consolidation of power by the North Vietnamese marked the beginning of a new era for Vietnam. The reunified country, now officially the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, confronted enormous challenges as it sought to rebuild a war-torn nation. The economic infrastructure was in ruins, and social cohesion was severely strained by years of conflict. The communist government undertook extensive efforts to restore stability, which included land reforms, the nationalization of industries, and the restructuring of agriculture. Despite these efforts, the long-term social and economic effects of the war were significant. Unexploded ordnance left over from the conflict continued to pose dangers, with large areas of land remaining hazardous and hampering agricultural development. Additionally, the widespread use of chemical agents like Agent Orange had enduring health consequences, contributing to a range of serious medical issues, including cancer and birth defects among the Vietnamese population. The war's legacy of environmental damage and social disruption continued to affect Vietnam's recovery and development well into the subsequent decades. Two impact on the U.S. In the United States, the Vietnam War's legacy led to substantial changes in military policy and doctrine. The conflict prompted a reevaluation of U.S. military strategies and practices, leading to a shift towards an all-volunteer force and the abolition of the draft. This change was part of a broader effort to reform military policies and reduce the social and political tensions associated with compulsory military service. The War Powers Act of 1973, enacted in response to the executive overreach observed during the Vietnam War, sought to limit the president's ability to engage in military conflicts without congressional approval, reflecting a desire to prevent future military overreach. The Vietnam War also had a profound cultural and historical impact on the United States. The conflict and its aftermath became a major theme in American culture, influencing numerous films, books, and studies that explored the complexities and consequences of the war. Works such as Apocalypse Now, Full Metal Jacket, and the Vietnam War documentary by Ken Burns provided critical reflections on the war's impact and its broader significance. These cultural outputs serve not only as a means of processing the collective trauma experienced by soldiers and civilians, but also as a platform for ongoing public debate about the war's lessons and legacy. In summary, the Vietnam War's legacy is marked by the extensive efforts required for post-war reconstruction and healing in Vietnam, alongside significant shifts in U.S. military policy and cultural reflection. The war's enduring effects on both nations continue to shape their historical narratives and societal values, underscoring the complex and far-reaching consequences of one of the 20th century's most divisive conflicts. As we reach the end of our journey through the Vietnam War, it's essential to reflect on the profound and far-reaching impact this conflict had on both Vietnam and the United States. This war was not just a battle fought on the ground, but a deeply transformative event that reshaped nations, altered military doctrines, and influenced cultural landscapes. It tested the limits of human endurance and resilience, leaving behind a legacy that continues to resonate today. For Vietnam, the war marked the beginning of a challenging era of reunification and reconstruction. The scars of battle and the consequences of chemical warfare left indelible marks on the land and its people, influencing their path towards recovery and growth. In the United States, the echoes of the Vietnam War led to critical changes in military policy and sparked a wave of cultural reflection. The conflict became a defining moment in American history, shaping not just policies but the very way Americans view their place in the world. As we look back on this complex and controversial chapter, we see a tapestry woven with both tragedy and triumph. The lessons learned from Vietnam remind us of the intricate interplay between warfare, politics, and human experience. They urge us to seek understanding, to remember the sacrifices made, and to ensure that history's lessons guide us towards a more informed and empathetic future. Thank you for joining us on this comprehensive exploration of the Vietnam War. As we close this chapter, let us carry forward the insights gained and remain mindful of the enduring legacy of this pivotal period in history. The past, after all, is not just a record of what was but a guide for what might be, shaping our present and informing our future.